Big hand.
There you go. Most of us nowadays are just worried if our flight is on time or not. And I know it can really suck when your flight's delayed. However, perhaps we should now be asking the question of whether our flights are going to be scheduled in the first place. A long looming pilot shortage is now threatening the U.S., and it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. If the airlines can't maintain the amount of pilots they need, they might have to park airplanes, close routes, and maybe even shut down. The question I'm asking here today is what main factors have caused the pilot shortage in the United States? Factors I'm going to share with you today are the changing nature of warfare, retirement, and the 2-year-old rule that changed absolutely everything. But before we get to all that, let me give you some quick background. So, according to David Foltz of Atlas Air Cargo, back in the good old days, being like 10 to 40 years ago, airlines could be really tough about the requirements to apply and really picky about who they hired. Back then, the market was oversaturated with pilots. Nowadays, the number of qualified pilots in the U.S. has dropped quite significantly and is starting to become a problem. David Halsey of Mokulele Airlines talked to me about the difference between regional airlines and major airlines. Regional airlines are a lot smaller than major airlines. They each have about 50% of the market. They're linked together directly. And regional airlines' main job is to get people from smaller communities to major hubs. And then major airlines' job is to get people from major hub to major hub. Now what I mean by pilot shortage is basically that airlines, and particularly the regionals, are struggling to find enough pilots to keep all of their airplanes flying. Because of the way the airline industry is set up, pilot shortage will mainly affect the regional airlines, but if left unchecked, can affect the whole industry. Now let's go ahead and talk about the changing nature of warfare. So I just mentioned how the market used to be oversaturated with pilots. And one of the other things that David Halsey pointed out to me was that a big cause of this was both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Let's see. The aircraft we used back then could only do a fraction of the damage that the aircraft of today can do. Because the technology was so much lower back then, we needed a lot more airplanes to get the same job done. With more airplanes comes more pilots, and both the Air Force and the Navy had to train a lot of pilots to fight these conflicts. This, in turn, ended up dumping a lot of pilots into the airline industry about a decade later. So you can see with this graph here that the number of military pilots going into the major airlines dropped about 60% in about 20 years. So that shows you how the technology is going up. They need less pilots in the military, so that contributes less and less to the airline industry indirectly. Now this, probably the biggest and scariest factor in all of this is the retirements. Nathan Apodaca of SkyWest Airlines told me that he has definitely seen the effects of the pilot shortage and mostly all the retirements. For example, his training class was about 70 people. 12 years ago, those classes were less than 10 people. So you can see that people moving from the regional airlines to the major airlines, a ton of people need to come in to replace them. That's why the classes are getting bigger. A few years ago, Congress changed the retirement age for pilots from 60 to 65. And this in and of itself shows that the pilot shortage is a big deal because all the pilots I interviewed agreed that Congress and the Federal Aviation Administration were 100% just trying to buy time by raising the retirement age. Now let's go and look at this. This shows you right here. Let's go back. No, go back. There we go. So we're right here in 2016. You can see how the retirement numbers are getting steeper and steeper. Now, these numbers don't even include retirements for other reasons. So according to Aviation Week magazine, there are an expected 20,000 cockpit seats expected to open up in the next 20 years. Or next 7 years, sorry about that. If the situation doesn't sound bad enough already, just wait until you hear about this. 1,500-hour rule. According to an NTSB National Transportation Safety Board accident report from 2009, an airplane making an approach into Buffalo, New York, stalled and crashed, killing all 49 on board. Now, I won't go into details with this, but as a result of this crash, the Federal Aviation Administration decided it would be a great idea to raise the minimum number of hours you needed to fly as an airline pilot from 250 to 1,500, a six-fold increase. Basically, you used to be able to spend like $30,000 to $40,000, get your commercial pilot's license, and go straight to a regional airline. Now, this has created this like ginormous gap between when people get their ratings and their commercial to when they can actually go start working for an airline. People can bridge that gap by flight instructing or going to a small airline, going to a four-year aviation university. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. I know people that have done it all kinds of different ways. Now, because of this rule, students wanting to become airline pilots are facing a much longer and much more expensive journey. Looking at the situation from the airline's perspective, the other factors that I've already talked about made this situation pretty bad. This made it like 10 times worse. In the words of Captain Craig Foltz of United Airlines, all of these factors have combined to kind of create a perfect storm to create a big pilot shortage. Now, obviously, there's more to the story than I've just had time to talk about here. But through this speech, I basically just wanted to help you understand the factors, the biggest factors contributing to the pilot shortage. Those factors being the changing nature of warfare, all the retirements, and the 1,500-hour rule. There's much that can be done to combat this problem, but that's what I'm going to talk to you about in my next speech. Above all, I just want to encourage you guys to think about getting into aviation someday, whether that be for a hobby or for a career. Soaring like the birds is the ultimate form of freedom.